everyone, and welcome back to the Zoospiracy podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca, and thank you so much for being here today for episode 7. Let me tell you why this episode even came to mind to me. It's because back in college, I was a hostess at a restaurant on the beach, and one of the waiters there was obsessed with this animal and basically brain dumped all the information he knew about them. And I was flabbergasted because I did not have any sort of clue the lore and the history behind this species. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys about it today. And so let's get right into it. Now, if you are new here, Zoospiracy is a wildlife true crime podcast where everything you thought you knew about animals gets a little bit flipped. Here, we don't just talk about animals, we investigate them. We look at them as individuals with lives, personalities, roles, and sometimes as the victim. Every episode is a case file where we break down what happened, who was involved, and how human decisions shaped that outcome. Because in the animal world, the truth isn't always natural. Sometimes it's man-made. The most common city bird is also one of our oldest strangers. In the crowds, on the ledges, and huddled outside a train station in the rain, it peers at us. It's not a rat. It's not wild. It's actually a domestic ghost. What story lies behind its quiet coo and the thud of its wings on concrete, you may ask? Well, today we're going to get into that case. Imagine you're walking through a city, any city, New York, LA, Chicago, maybe London, or even Rome. It does not matter. Because there on the sidewalk, on the ledge, or on the roof of that parking garage, you see it. Pigeons. And I don't think any of us really take a hard look at them, right? We step around them, wave our hand, and maybe even mutter something under our breaths that is quite common. Rats with wings. And this is what really gets me, because I've definitely heard that term growing up and never really thought much about it. But today, we're going to be digging into the history and the story that goes behind this species that's really everywhere today. The phrase rats with wings is one of the most successful pieces of pigeon propaganda ever deployed against any animal, to be honest. The animal it was deployed against didn't just coexist with humans. It didn't just tolerate us either. They actually served us incredibly, may I add. For thousands of years, pigeons saved lives. They won wars, they crossed oceans with us, and they even starved alongside us while building civilizations alongside us too. And now we just call it a rat. No hate on rats either, because those are also incredibly complex animals. But today we are talking all about pigeons. The specific bird in question is Columba livia, or the rock pigeon. Formally, it's termed Columba livia domestica in the urban form. The same species your ancestors bred as racing birds and messenger birds. The same species that crossed battlefields with capsules strapped to its legs. Rock pigeons belong to the family Columbidae, which also includes all pigeon species and doves. Domesticated forms were present in Mesopotamia approximately 5,000 years ago, and later throughout Egypt, Rome, and the whole of the medieval world. The city pigeons you may pass every single morning are the direct descendants of escaped or abandoned domestic stock. So let me describe what exactly you're looking at when you see a pigeon on the street. Because, like me, I had no idea. And once you know, you may never look at them the same way again. The pigeon is, from a purely zoological standpoint, one of the most extraordinary birds that has ever existed on this planet. Let's start with its brain. Pigeons are capable of something that for a long time scientists believed were exclusive to humans and a handful of great apes. They can actually recognize themselves in a mirror. This is called the mirror self-recognition test, and it's one of the foundational benchmarks in cognitive science that measures self-awareness. And pigeons passed it with flying colors. Pigeons are able to pass multi-step memory tests where they can recognize individual human faces, maybe even yours, and remember it for years. They can discriminate between photographs and identify whether an image shows a human-made versus a natural object. They've demonstrated the ability to understand probability, not instinctively and not through conditioning, but through reasoning. In 2017, a study published demonstrated that pigeons can learn abstract mathematical rules about ordering and sequence, essentially grasping the concept of numbers in a ranked sense, where they were able to perform at a level previously thought to require a primate-level cerebral cortex. A bird with a brain the size of a walnut is doing things we assumed required a massive folded neocortex. And it gets stranger and maybe even more beautiful from here. Pigeons navigate using multiple overlapping systems simultaneously. They have magnetite crystals embedded in their beaks, which are biological compasses that can detect the Earth's magnetic field. They read the position of the sun, and they detect infrasound, which is low-frequency sound waves that can travel thousands of miles. These sound waves can be produced by ocean waves, weather systems, geological formations, and they use those waves to actually triangulate their positions. They can detect polarized light patterns that are invisible to the human eye, and recent research suggests that they may also use olfactory maps, or navigation by smell, where they detect chemical signatures in air currents and build three-dimensional spatial models of the landscape around them. A homing pigeon released in an unknown location will process all of that simultaneously: the magnetic fields, sun angles, infrasound, polarized light, olfactory data, and then plot a route home. This can be done across hundreds of miles, over mountains, cities, and even in the dark. And here's something extra special, if that doesn't cover it enough. They can do this in complete cloud cover. No sun, no stars. It's just like they know. The fastest recorded pigeon flight is 92.5 miles per hour. They can sustain 60 to 70 miles per hour over hundreds of miles without rest. Their hearts beat over 600 times per minute at full speed, and their respiratory systems are so efficient that they can outpace the oxygenation capacity of almost any mammal equivalent to their size. And they're romantic. They mate for life. Both parents incubate eggs and raise the chicks together. Pigeons produce something called crop milk, which is a protein and fat-rich secretion from the lining of their crop that they can feed directly to their young. Only pigeons and a handful of other species produce a true functional analog to mammalian milk. It's like a bird that lactates, kind of, but not exactly. Pigeons can live up to 15 years. They can feel pain, and they even grieve. When a mated partner dies, pigeons have been observed showing behaviors consistent with mourning, like withdrawal, reduced feeding, and altered vocalizations. And this is the animal we call a rat with wings. So how exactly did we get here with pigeons? Let's lay out this crime scene because it's not an alley with blood and evidence, but more of a city plaza littered with crumbs, droppings, and a dozen unsuspecting suspects perched on the ledges above. The pigeon's presence in American cities is not a natural phenomenon. It's a human construction. Every single feral pigeon in the United States exists because we put it here. The rock pigeon, Columba livia, is native to coastal cliffs and rocky outcroppings in South Asia, North Africa, and Southern Europe. Its wild ancestors nested on cliff faces. The ledges of buildings that you'll notice that they like to be on are extraordinarily similar to those cliff faces. This is because it's an animal finding the closest available approximation of its natural habitat in a landscape we built and placed them in. So let's look closer at the timeline here. Humans first domesticated pigeons somewhere around 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, which today is modern-day Iraq and Syria. This makes them one of the earliest domesticated animals in human history, right alongside dogs, goats, and sheep. There's actually evidence of kept pigeons in ancient Egyptian tombs and Mesopotamian tablets dating to 3000 BCE. They were initially kept for food, termed squab or young pigeon, which was a dietary staple for most of human civilization well into the 19th century. Before refrigeration, before industrial farming, before the global food supply chain we take for granted, pigeons were one of the few reliable, self-reproducing protein sources a community could maintain. But they became something else very quickly. They basically became the internet of the ancient world. The Egyptians used them to carry military messages. The Persians used them. Julius Caesar used homing pigeons to coordinate his legions during the conquest of Gaul. The Crusaders, the Ottoman Empire, and in the 12th century, the Sultan of Baghdad ran a pigeon postal system across his entire empire. In medieval Europe, pigeon lofts were so valuable that they were restricted to the nobility and the monasteries by law. So the common person could not have a pigeon loft because information was power, and at the time, pigeons were how you controlled information. Even Genghis Khan maintained a pigeon relay system that spanned his entire empire from China to Eastern Europe. When news had to move, the pigeons moved it. And then we get to America. European colonists brought pigeons to North America in the early 1600s. The first recorded introduction was in 1606 in Port Royal, Nova Scotia. More followed throughout the 17th and 18th centuries to Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York. Virginia colony archives from the early colonial period mention, quote, English pigeons brought over on ships by settlers. George Washington reportedly kept pigeons at Mount Vernon, and they were brought as livestock, as messengers, and a piece of the domestic infrastructure of civilization that European settlers simply couldn't imagine living without. And then America industrialized. The telegraph was invented, and then the telephone. And right at that moment, when pigeons stopped being necessary for communication, right at the moment when we could send a message across the continent in seconds, something happened. Something fucked up happened. We just let them go. Really sit with me here about what happened because it's super upsetting to me. For thousands of years, humans selectively bred the pigeon. We chose which birds mated, we chose which traits survived, and we created their homing instinct, or rather, we amplified it beyond what wild birds possessed through generations of deliberate selection. We built into their genetics a compulsion to return home no matter what. They will return home. It's what they do, and it's what we made them to do. But then we stopped providing them a home. When the telegraph made pigeon post obsolete in the mid-1800s, pigeon lofts across Europe and America were simply abandoned. The birds that had been domesticated for generations and bred to depend on human-maintained loft structures, which were shaped by human selection to live in close proximity to people, these birds were just released or left when their keepers walked away. And then they did exactly what they were bred to do. They stayed near human structures, and they nested on the closest things to a cliff face that they could find. And eventually they became feral. And here's the distinction that matters even more, zoologically and morally. Feral is not the same as wild. A wild animal has adapted over millennia to its natural ecosystem, and a feral animal is a domesticated one that returned to an unmanaged state. They're not interlopers or runaways, and in this case, they really aren't even a runaway. These are animals that we let out of the door and then locked it, surprised to find them sitting on the porch. The feral pigeon population in American cities exploded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and for a while, nobody really cared. Cities reported pigeon flocks on ledges, newspapers complained of, quote, pigeon filth on statues, and some cities took measures. Chicago once reportedly hired marksmen to cull flocks near the stockyards. But pigeons were just a part of urban life at this point. They were a feature the way that street lamps and cobblestones were. And then World War I occurred. Here is a name I want you to remember. Cher Ami. October 1918, the Argonne Forest, France. An American battalion, the so-called Lost Battalion, where 554 men of the 77th Infantry Division was surrounded by German forces, cut off from their own lines, being accidentally shelled by friendly artillery because command didn't know their position. They've already lost over 300 men, and they're running out of food, running out of ammunition too. But they're sending pigeons, one after another, trying to get a message through to the headquarters to stop the friendly fire. But the Germans are shooting these pigeons out of the sky, one by one. Cher Ami is the last pigeon that they have. He was released into the open air where the Germans opened fire immediately. He gets hit and goes down, but he gets back up into the air even though he's struggling. At this point, he's missing a leg. His chest is torn open by shrapnel, and he is, by all measures, dying. He flies 25 miles in 25 minutes, where he arrives finally at division headquarters with the message still attached to the one leg that is no longer actually attached to his body, but more of like hanging. The capsule is literally hanging from a tendon. He delivers the message and the shelling stops. 194 men survive who would have otherwise died without Cher-Ami. Cher-Ami was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government. He was preserved by taxidermy when he died, only months later from his wounds, and he's displayed in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where he remains to this day. Here's something to really understand. Cher-Ami was not exceptional for a pigeon. He was exceptional in his circumstance. His biology, though, is the biology of every pigeon you see walking across the subway grate. And it's what allowed him to do that heroic job. The navigational systems, the cardiovascular endurance, the drive to return home that we spent 10,000 years engineering to his species is really just exactly what pigeons do. During World War II, the United States Army had a signal pigeon corps. At its peak, 54,000 homing pigeons in active military service. They saved thousands of lives, and one pigeon, named G.I. Joe, saved the lives of at least 1,000 British soldiers by delivering a message that prevented an Allied airstrike on a town they'd just captured, with no other way to get the word through in time. G.I. Joe was awarded the Dickon Medal, which is the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. This was awarded by the Lord Mayor of London, and this pigeon lived out his days at the Detroit Zoological Society. We sent these animals into combat. We relied on them when everything else failed. When the radios were down, when the runners were dead, and when the lines were cut, we reached for the pigeon. Never once, not even once, did they ever let us down. But then the war ended, and the Army auctioned off all of its pigeon corpse stock, and then most of them became feral. In any good investigation, we must look at the suspects, the factors, and the forces that turned a decorated war hero and ancient partner into a designated pest. So let's examine them one by one. Suspect 1 is human feeding. Pigeons thrive on handouts and food waste. Tourists feeding bread, seeds scatter onto plazas. Localized feeding absolutely creates the concentrations of pigeons we have today, because if there's more food, there will be more birds in a given spot. I mean, it's just common sense. The evidence here is correlative, but definitely real. Suspect 2 is the architecture. Cities gave pigeons thousands of cliff face substitutes. Skyscraper ledges, church spires, windowsills, bridge abutments, endless nesting sites, basically. And studies show that pigeons nest more in older buildings with cavities and grooves versus modern sleek buildings with reduced available roosting. I always remember seeing birds, maybe not necessarily pigeons, but in the letters of like grocery stores and stuff growing up. Now, suspect 3 is the absence of natural predators. In rural environments, hawks and falcons kept the pigeon numbers in check. In urban canyons, these predators are scarce, though interestingly, some cities now maintain peregrine falcon populations specifically for bird control. Pigeon densities in cities with no raptors run 5 to 10 times higher than those with active predator populations. Suspect 4 is their reproductive rate. A pigeon pair can raise 4 to 6 broods a year in urban conditions. That's potentially a dozen offspring annually from a single nest. So even with control efforts, populations can bounce back really fast. Suspect 5 is something to really pay attention to, which is disease. Pigeons are blamed for histoplasmosis, encephalitis, salmonella, and other things. Terms like flying rats, disease vectors, and so on makes this suspect on the sheet constantly. So what's the evidence? It's pretty weak, to be honest. The World Health Organization and the CDC have both reviewed the epidemiological data. Pigeons are, in fact, rarely the source of disease transmission to humans. Histoplasmosis is more strongly linked to bat guano than pigeon droppings. Studies in major cities like Paris, New York, and London find that pigeons carry far fewer dangerous parasites than commonly assumed. In one Paris study, researchers found 0 rat fleas on feral pigeons. Literally 0. The animals whose fleas spread the plague was not on the pigeons. The disease narrative is largely mythology, but it's extremely useful mythology, as we will see in a moment. And then let's talk about the 6th suspect, the one that ties all of these others together. Policy and profit. Here's where the story takes a strange turn. The transformation of the pigeon from war hero to urban pest didn't happen by accident. It was accelerated by a specific cultural moment, which I want to be precise about. The phrase rats with wings was a phrase that redefined public perception of the pigeon in the modern era, and it was popularized by a 1980s film, a Woody Allen film to be exact, called Stardust Memories. A character in the movie refers to pigeons as rats with wings, and it caught on like wildfire. Before that, the dominant cultural image of the pigeon was the carrier pigeon, noble, useful, and historic. But after that film, it was just a flying rat. Of course, the film didn't create the sentiment out of nothing, though. By 1980, the pigeon had already been quietly rebranded by urban management policy. Cities had begun adopting pest control frameworks for pigeons in the 1960s and 1970s. New York City declared pigeons a nuisance species, and pest control companies, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, had a very significant financial interest in keeping the pigeon categorized as a pest. Anti-roosting spikes, chemical deterrents, ultrasonic devices, and lethal control programs all represent the enormous economic activity. The pigeon being a problem is good for business. And then there's the matter of feeding laws. Dozens of American cities have passed ordinances making it illegal to feed pigeons in public spaces. These include San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Denver. There's actually real fines where people have been cited, fined, or occasionally arrested for feeding pigeons. Pigeons, a bird that we domesticated, a bird that we bred to be comfortable around humans, and a bird we made entirely dependent on their closeness to human activity, is illegal. Let me just say that again clearly, because we created an animal that depends on humans. We bred that dependence into them over 10,000 years of selective breeding, and then we made it illegal to address that dependence. We engineered a dependency and then criminalized relieving it. And the science on the rationale for these feeding bans is really interesting. Cities argue that feeding encourages population growth. There's something to the localized concentration argument, but here's what the data actually shows. Population control through food restriction has never worked as a pigeon management strategy, not even once, not anywhere it's been tried. Because pigeons are extraordinarily adaptable foragers. They disperse, they find other food, and the carrying capacity of a feral pigeon population in a given urban environment is determined by the available nesting sites, not by how much bread someone scatters in the park. But that argument, the rationale, scientifically supported argument, you could say, doesn't sell pest control contracts. It doesn't really get talked about much at all. So let's look at the real evidence. What does the research actually say when you pull it from the shelf and read it? Population surveys in major cities like Chicago, London, Mumbai, Seattle do confirm thousands of birds in dense flocks. Seattle's Pioneer Square had an estimated 5,000 birds in a single area in 2010. So that's real. Pigeons are genuinely abundant. But on disease, multiple reviews from WHO and CDC analysis found no major disease outbreaks traced to feral urban pigeons. One study examined the parasite load on urban pigeons found that the common species carried was not the one responsible for major zoonotic transmission to humans. The scary rap sheet really just doesn't hold up. Now, on property damage, pigeon droppings do cost cities real money to clean. Their uric acid content does damage masonry over time, but engineering reviews of historic monuments have found that most structural damage actually comes from neglected maintenance, not pigeon activity alone. The exclusion netting, when installed correctly, saves money long-term without harming birds. On beneficial roles, here's something that you may not have heard about pigeons. Pigeons actually clean up grain and seed waste that humans generate. They are key food sources for urban predators like the peregrine falcons that cities have actually spent money on reintroducing. Studies of pigeon breeding also contribute to the foundational discoveries in genetics and urban ecology. So they're not a one-sided ledger. And then there's this. In 2019, one study examined a contraceptive pigeon feed called ovocontrol and found that it reduced hatch rates by approximately 90% in trial populations. The birds live out their natural lives, the population shrinks, and the relationship between humans and pigeons is managed humanely, without killing and without suffering. No American city, though, has implemented this at scale, because the money for pigeon spikes just keeps flowing. Let's spend a little bit of time on the urban myths, because you really can't investigate a pigeon without running into them, right? Something you might have heard of before is that they carry bird flu. But the reality is that wild rock pigeons in the United States have never been documented with H5N1 or H7N9 in the USGS Avian Disease Database, not even once. Bird flu circulates in waterfowl populations where pigeons are not the culprit. Some people may say that they attack you. This occasionally might have a grain of truth because a pigeon protecting its nest will sometimes act defensively, but, quote, attack is a bit of a stretch. They are overwhelmingly prey animals whose first and strongest instinct is to flee. Another common thing people say is that pigeon populations are out of control and growing. But the reality is that in many cities, pigeon populations have stabilized or declined in recent decades as building architecture has modernized and ledge access has decreased. One truth is that they are descendants of dinosaurs, as are all birds, which is probably not what people mean when they say it. And then here's a big unspoken mystery, right? Why don't we ever see baby pigeons? I'm sure you've noticed baby sparrows, baby ducks, baby robins, everywhere. But baby pigeons, almost never. And here's why. Pigeon nests are almost always hidden in building cavities, under bridge infrastructure, or high on ledges that are unreachable from the ground. Young pigeons stay in the nest far longer than most birds, almost a month. And by the time they fledge, they look basically like adults. You don't see them because they're hidden until the moment they look like everything else. So no, there are no baby pigeons that you're missing. You've actually been looking at them all along and just didn't know it. So the mystery of the city pigeon is not really a mystery at all. It's a story about how we project fear onto the things we don't look at closely, and how we stop looking closely at things we've decided not to like anymore. On this podcast, I've covered several stories, including conservation crises, mysteries, or crime events that have happened. And of course, those stories matter, and I'll definitely keep telling them. But this story bothers me in a little bit of a specific and different way. With most conservation stories, there's a human-nature divide. Humans encroaching on wild spaces, humans disrupting natural systems. There's always a version of these stories where the animal was just doing its thing and we decided to get in the way. But with the pigeon, there's no such version. We found them, domesticated them, and bred them. We shaped their neurology and their physiology to suit our purposes. We put them in cages, we took them across oceans, and we put capsules on their legs and dropped them into active combat zones. We used their bodies as a postal system in our military communications network for 10,000 years. And today, we just call them rats. There's a term in animal ethics research called manufactured dependency. It refers to the ethical obligations that arise when humans deliberately engineer an organism's reliance on human infrastructure. The classic example is the domestic dogs. Dogs cannot survive in most environments without human support because we made them that way. society has largely accepted that this manufactured dependency creates responsibilities. We have animal welfare laws, we have shelters, and we have cultural norms around abandonment for certain animals. But the pigeon is the largest scale example of that manufactured dependency in the history of human-animal relationships. And essentially, it's gone with no legal protection in most of the United States. Feral pigeons are not covered by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is the primary federal law that protects wild birds. This is because they're classified as introduced non-native species. They're not classified as domestic animals, so they don't receive the welfare protections that apply to pets and livestock. Basically, they exist in a legal gray zone, a category of animal the law essentially doesn't see. We made them, and then we made them invisible. The feral pigeon has no natural habitat to return to. The cliff colonies of the original wild Columbia livia, which is the ancient rock pigeon of the Himalayan foothills and the North African coast, are not accessible to the feral birds of our cities. They've been domesticated far too long. Their populations are too far removed, and the urban environment is now their natural habitat, which is the one we built and the one we put them in. I want to end somewhere today different from where I usually land. Because most of the time here on this podcast, I'm reporting on systems that are failing. And this system is partly that, but there are people fighting. There are actually pigeon welfare organizations that are operating in cities across America, which are largely volunteer-run and largely ignored by mainstream animal welfare institutions. But they're there. NYC Pigeon Rescue Central, Palomacy Pigeon and Dove Adoptions in the San Francisco Bay Area actually rehabilitate injured feral pigeons and place domesticated birds in foster homes. Researchers at Oxford, at Duke, at the University of Montana, who keep publishing extraordinary work on pigeon cognition and navigation, work that if the subject were a dolphin or an elephant, it would be front page news. There's also a movement, slow, underfunded, but real, towards what is called the Trap, Neuter, Return, or TNR for feral pigeon populations. It's been piloted in several European cities, including Switzerland, where it's pioneered by a doctor at the University of Basel. This doctor's work demonstrates that when you provide managed loft spaces where pigeons can actually roost and lay eggs and where caretakers swap real eggs for decoys to prevent hatching, populations actually stabilize and then decrease over time. These birds can concentrate in areas like this where they would cause the least and minimal nuisance. They can be monitored for health, and the relationship between humans and pigeons is managed with dignity rather than cruelty. The birds can live, the population shrinks, and then everyone benefits. But no American city today, at the time of this recording, has implemented this at scale. Not even one. The money for pigeon spikes just keeps flowing. The feeding fines keep being issued, and the pest control contracts keep getting renewed. So here's the final verdict. Not guilt and not innocence, just this. The pigeon is an unmistakable mirror of ourselves. In feeding them, in cursing them, in trying to control them, we see our own cities and our own priorities reflected back at us. Every pest often reflects a habitat we created. Pigeons flourished because we built the urban ecosystem they needed, but then abandoned them to it. This lesson is not just about pigeons. It's about what happens every single time infrastructure creates a dependency and then walks away. Compassion over fear. That's where the science and the ethics converge. Humane control does work. Lethal methods like poisons, glue traps fail, and they often harm other wildlife in the process. Glue traps are one of the most evil things that you guys can use, and poison really is no better because when you poison a pest, another animal may try to consume it because it's easier to hunt, and then you hurt that predator. Decades of research says this. When we understand the carrying capacity, manage the nesting sites, and treat the animals with the seriousness owed to them since we spent 10,000 years engineering them to live alongside us, is something we can do, but it's something we choose not to. And every morning, somewhere in this country, a veteran of World War II, maybe in his late 90s now, if he's still alive, walks past a pigeon on the sidewalk. And maybe, just maybe, he remembers what those birds did, what they meant, and what we asked of them, and what we owe. I want to leave you with one last piece of evidence, which is one I keep coming back to. In 2022, researchers at the University of California published a study on the navigational capabilities of feral urban pigeons in LA. What they found was really striking because despite living for generations in an environment with no loft, no designated home base, no keeper, and no release and return structure, these birds maintained sophisticated, stable spatial maps of the city. They had territories, they had routes, and they navigated them with the same multi-system precision as their homing ancestors. The ability is still there, encoded in their genes, just waiting. But we abandoned them. We stripped away the structure that was built for them originally and then condemned them for adapting. We removed the home and then punished them for treating our ledges and our bridges and our station rooftops as home today. And still, they still demonstrate everything we engineered them to demonstrate: loyalty to a place, intelligence, navigation, and endurance. They're still doing exactly what we made them to do. We're just not watching anymore. The pigeon didn't become a pest. We just decided to call it one. And that's the difference. There's a real significant moral difference, and I think we really owe it to ourselves. Not even the birds for a second. I think we owe it to ourselves to be honest about what kind of relationship we want to have with living things that we share this world with, especially the ones that we made. Next time you see a pigeon, I hope that you actually look at it. Look at the iridescent feathers, the green and purple sheen on the neck that most people never notice because they never stop to look. Watch how it moves and watch how it watches you back. A pigeon can recognize your face. It can remember you, and it has a magnetic compass in its beak and a map of the earth's sound in its ears. It mates for life and it grieves. It was there when Rome burned. It was there in the trenches, and it's here now, right on our sidewalks. And still, it's extraordinary. Keep listening, keep questioning in the city of birds.